The sound of gunshots echoed through the dusty streets of Holbrook, Arizona territory, as Vaughn Hayes stood with his back against the weathered wall of the saloon, watching the commotion with disinterested eyes. It was 1876, and like most frontier towns, Holbrook had its share of hot-headed gunslingers looking to make a name for themselves. But Vaughn had long ago stopped caring about such displays. At 32, he'd seen enough bloodshed during his time riding with the cavalry after the war to last several lifetimes. "You heard about the job posting?" Old Man Thompson asked, sidling up beside him as they watched the town marshal break up the fight. Vaughn shifted his weight, adjusting the worn Stetson that shaded his eyes from the relentless Arizona sun. "What job posting?" "The McAllister Ranch, looking for a cook." Thompson spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Pays good money, too." "You still looking for a hand to help at your place?" Vaughn nodded slowly. 6 months ago, he'd used his life savings to purchase a modest cattle ranch 10 miles outside of town. The previous owner had died suddenly, leaving behind a half-built house and a small herd. Vaughn had been working himself to exhaustion trying to manage it alone. A cook would free up precious hours each day. "Might be worth looking into," Vaughn said, pushing himself away from the wall. His ranch wasn't much, but it was his something he never thought possible for a man who'd spent most of his life with no roots to speak of. The marshal's office had a bulletin board outside where notices were posted. Amidst wanted posters and land sales, Vaughn found the advertisement. "Cook needed at McAllister Ranch. Inquire at Holbrook General Store." 20 minutes later, Vaughn was speaking with Walter McAllister, a cattle baron who owned the largest spread in Navajo County. "I've got a woman who needs work," McAllister explained, his voice gruff from years of shouting orders across open range. "Excellent cook, clean, hardworking. But there's something you should know: she can't speak. Mute since birth, I'm told." Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "How do you know she needs work if she can't tell you?" "Her brother brought her to town 2 weeks ago, left her with a letter explaining her situation. Said their parents died of influenza back east. He went on to California to find work, promised to send for her." McAllister shook his head. "That was 2 weeks ago. Poor girl's been staying with my wife's cousin, helping around their house, but they can't keep her indefinitely." "What's her name?" Vaughn asked. "Zara Thornton. 24 years old, educated from what I understand, can read and write just fine." Vaughn considered this information. He'd always been a man of few words himself. The idea of sharing his home with someone who wouldn't fill it with needless chatter had a certain appeal. "Where is she now?" "Working at the Mercantile. My wife's cousin owns it. Want to meet her." Vaughn nodded, and McAllister led him across the street to Holbrook's General Store. A bell jangled as they entered the dimly lit space filled with the scent of leather, coffee, and dried goods. A slender woman stood behind the counter, carefully arranging tins of food on a shelf. When the bell rang, she turned. Zara Thornton had dark chestnut hair pulled back into a simple bun, a few tendrils escaping to frame a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, possessed a quiet dignity that caught Vaughn's attention. Her eyes were her most striking feature, large and expressive, a deep amber color that reminded him of whiskey held up to firelight. McAllister made introductions, explaining that Vaughn was looking for a cook. Zara studied Vaughn with those remarkable eyes, assessing him with a directness that few women would dare. She didn't smile, didn't attempt to charm or impress. She simply looked at him, waiting. Mrs. Collins, the store owner's wife, brought out a slate and chalk. Zara took it and wrote in a neat, flowing script. "What does the position entail?" Vaughn explained the situation: a small ranch. Just himself, long days of work, a half-finished house that needed tending. He'd provide room and board plus $10 a month, which was generous for a cook's position. Zara wrote, I can cook, clean, mend clothing, make soap, tend a garden, preserve food, and keep accounts. Accounts? Vaughn asked, surprised. She nodded and wrote, My father was a banker. He taught me mathematics and bookkeeping. Something about her confident penmanship and straightforward manner impressed Vaughn. This wasn't a helpless woman looking for charity. This was someone with skills to offer. When can you start? He asked. Tomorrow, she wrote, and just like that the arrangement was made. The next morning, Vaughn brought his wagon to town to collect Zara and her belongings. She had just one trunk and a smaller valise, which he loaded easily. She wore a simple blue dress, practical for travel, with a matching bonnet that shaded her face from the sun. As they left Holbrook behind, Vaughn found himself unusually aware of the woman sitting beside him on the wagon bench. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it was the most peaceful journey Vaughn had experienced in a long time. No pressure to make conversation, no awkward attempts at pleasantries. Just the creak of the wagon wheels, the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves, and the vast Arizona landscape stretching around them. Occasionally, Zara would point to something, a hawk circling overhead, a cluster of wildflowers growing improbably from the rocky soil, and Vaughn would nod in acknowledgement. They developed a simple form of communication without words, and by the time his ranch came into view, Vaughn realized he'd enjoyed the trip more than he'd expected. The Hayes ranch was modest, but promising. A small, sturdy house stood half-completed on a rise overlooking a creek that ran year-round, a precious resource in this arid land. A barn and corral housed his horses and the wagon. Beyond the immediate homestead, spread grazing land where 60 head of cattle roamed under the watchful eye of his cattle dog, Rusty, who came bounding up to the wagon as they approached. Zara's face showed no disappointment at the humble property. Instead, her eyes moved methodically over the buildings and land, as if cataloging work to be done. When Rusty approached, she extended her hand carefully, letting the dog sniff her before scratching behind his ears. The dog, normally wary of strangers, leaned into her touch with immediate approval. That's unusual, Vaughn remarked. He doesn't take to people easily. Zara smiled, a small but genuine expression that transformed her serious face, and scribbled on her slate. Dogs don't need words to understand kindness. Vaughn showed her to her quarters, a small but clean room he'd hastily prepared off the kitchen. The house had 4 rooms, completed the kitchen with a sturdy iron stove, a main living area, his bedroom, and now hers. The rest was framed but not yet finished, with exposed beams and no proper walls. I'm working on it when I can, he explained, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the state of the place. Cattle come first. Zara nodded and wrote, I can help with the finishing work when my other duties allow. Vaughn raised his eyebrows. You know carpentry, basic skills, she wrote. My father believed in practical education. She requested a tour of the kitchen, and Vaughn showed her the stores he had, mostly beans, flour, coffee, and salt pork. It wasn't much, but Zara didn't seem fazed. She wrote that she would prepare supper and asked to see the vegetable garden afterward. The vegetable garden was more aspiration than reality, a few scraggly plants struggling in the harsh conditions. Zara studied it, then wrote that with proper care, it could be productive by late summer. She pointed to the creek and made motions about irrigation. You know about growing things? Vaughn asked. She nodded and wrote, My mother had a garden in Pennsylvania. Different climate, but plants still need the same basic things. That evening, Vaughn sat down to the first home-cooked meal he'd had in months. Somehow, Zara had transformed his basic provisions into a flavorful stew with fresh baked biscuits. It wasn't fancy, but it was hearty and delicious. As he ate, she sat across from him with her own plate, her eyes downcast, movements precise and economical. "This is good," he said after several minutes of silence. "Real good." She looked up, and that small, genuine smile appeared again. She nodded her thanks and continued eating. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Vaughn rose before dawn to tend the cattle, returning mid-morning for a hearty breakfast that Zara had waiting. He'd work until midday, break for a cold lunch she'd prepared, then work until dusk when a hot supper awaited him. In between, Zara transformed the neglected house into a home. The floors shone with regular scrubbing, curtains appeared at the windows, sewn from fabric she found in her own trunk, and the vegetable garden began to thrive under her careful attention. They developed their own language of gestures, expressions, and written notes. Zara kept a slate in the kitchen for longer messages, but often they communicated without it. Vaughn found himself attuned to her movements, able to tell from the tilt of her head or the set of her shoulders what she was trying to convey. She, in turn, seemed to read his moods with uncanny accuracy, knowing when he needed space after a difficult day, or when a cup of coffee and quiet company beside the fire would be welcome. One evening, about a month after Zara's arrival, Vaughn returned from town with supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to her without ceremony. "Saw this and thought you might find it useful," he said, his voice gruff with uncharacteristic self-consciousness. Zara unwrapped the package to find a small leather-bound book with blank pages and a fountain pen with a bottle of ink. Her eyes widened, and she looked up at him with a question in her expression. "Figured it might be easier than the slate sometimes," Vaughn explained, suddenly interested in removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. "And maybe you'd like to write things down that take more explaining." Zara immediately opened the book and wrote on the first page, "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. This is the most thoughtful gift I've received in a very long time." "Just Vaughn," he corrected, as he had several times before. "No need for formalities here." She smiled and wrote, "Vaughn," underlining it with a decisive stroke. That night after supper, instead of retiring to her room as usual, Zara sat at the table with her new journal and began to write. After several minutes, she slid the open book across to Vaughn, who was cleaning his revolver by the fire. "My story is not particularly interesting," she had written, "but perhaps you would like to know how I came to be in Holbrook. I was born in Philadelphia to good parents who never treated my lack of speech as a burden. My father was a bank clerk who taught me numbers, and my mother was a gentlewoman who taught me household arts. I had a brother, Daniel, 4 years older, who was my protector. When our parents died of influenza last winter, we lost our home to pay debts. Daniel heard there was work in California, so we traveled west together. In St. Louis, our money was stolen. Daniel took work on a cattle drive to earn passage, leaving me with the family of a man he'd befriended. They were kind at first, but the husband began to make unwelcome advances. I fled with what little I had and found my way to Holbrook by working in exchange for transportation. I am not looking for charity, only honest work until I can determine my future path." Vaughn read the passage twice, feeling anger build at the thought of anyone threatening her safety. When he looked up, Zara was watching him, her expression guarded. "Your brother," Vaughn said carefully, "does he know where you are now?" She shook her head and wrote, "I left no forwarding information with the family in St. Louis. It seemed safer. Would you like to try to contact him? I could send telegrams to the major towns in California." Zara considered this, then wrote, "Perhaps someday." For now, I am content here if you find my work satisfactory." "More than satisfactory," Vaughn said, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "This place hasn't been a proper home since I bought it. Now it is." A flush of color rose in Zara's cheeks, and she ducked her head, clearly pleased by the compliment. She wrote, "Would you tell me your story now? How did a man like you come to be alone on this ranch?" Vaughn wasn't accustomed to talking about himself, but somehow the written question made it easier to answer. He told her about growing up in Texas, losing his parents young, joining the cavalry during the war years, then drifting west afterward, working ranch jobs and saving every penny. He'd never had a place to call his own until now, never stayed in one spot long enough to put down roots. Never saw the point in settling, he admitted. But something about this land spoke to me. Figured it was time to build something that might last. Zara nodded, her eyes thoughtful, and wrote, "It takes courage to build something new." As summer progressed, the ranch began to prosper under their combined efforts. Vaughn hired 2 hands to help with the cattle, which gave him more time to work on completing the house. With the extra income from the growing herd, he purchased lumber for proper walls, glass for additional windows, and materials for a front porch where they could sit in the evenings to catch the cooler air. Zara's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented their meals. She preserved the excess for winter, filling the root cellar with jars of pickled beans, carrots, and beets. She also took over the ranch accounts, organizing Vaughn's haphazard records into a proper ledger that clearly showed income and expenses. For the first time, he had a clear picture of his financial situation, which was better than he'd realized. As they worked side by side, Vaughn found himself increasingly aware of Zara's presence. The scent of lavender that clung to her clothing, the way sunlight caught in her hair when she worked in the garden, the graceful efficiency of her movements as she cooked or cleaned all registered with a clarity that both pleased and unsettled him. One Saturday in late August, Vaughn took Zara to town for supplies. It was her first return to Holbrook since coming to the ranch, and he noticed how she held herself with a new confidence as they walked down the main street. Several townspeople greeted them with curious glances. Vaughn realized that to outside eyes, they might appear to be a married couple on a normal shopping expedition. The thought should have alarmed him, but instead, it felt strangely right. At the general store, Mrs. Collins exclaimed over Zara's healthy appearance. "My goodness, dear, ranch life clearly agrees with you. You're positively glowing." Zara smiled and nodded, her hand briefly touching Vaughn's arm in a gesture that had become one of their private signals, this one meaning she was comfortable and happy. As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Sheriff Miller approached, his expression grave. "Hayes," he nodded in greeting. "Miss Thornton. Thought you should know there's been word of a man asking questions about a woman matching your description, miss. Came through town about a week ago, saying he was looking for his fiancée who'd run off." Vaughn felt Zara stiffen beside him. She quickly pulled out her small slate and wrote, "What was his name?" "Called himself James Blackwell," the sheriff replied. "Said he was from St. Louis." Zara's face paled and she wrote rapidly, "Not my fiancé, the man who threatened me." Vaughn stepped closer to Zara, instinctively protective. "He's still in town. No, moved on when no one could help him," Sheriff Miller said. "Headed north, I believe. Just thought you should be aware in case he circles back this way." "Appreciate the warning," Vaughn said. He turned to Zara. "Ready to head home?" She nodded, her eyes troubled but resolute. The ride back to the ranch was tense. Vaughn could sense Zara's anxiety in the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her hands twisted in her lap. When they were about halfway home, he pulled the wagon to a stop in the shade of a large cottonwood tree by the creek. "Need to say something," he said, turning to face her directly. "That man, whoever he is, he won't get near you, not while I'm around." Zara pulled out her journal, which she now carried everywhere, and wrote, "I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Perhaps I should move on." "No," Vaughn said firmly. "The ranch is your home now, unless you want to leave." She shook her head emphatically and wrote, "I've never felt safe anywhere the way I do with you." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that what had begun as an employer-employee arrangement had become something far more significant. Vaughn found himself reaching for her hand. Her fingers were smaller than his, but strong and capable, marked with the honest calluses of hard work. She didn't pull away. "Then it's settled," he said. "We'll face whatever comes together." That evening, Vaughn took extra care securing the ranch. He cleaned his rifle and kept it loaded by the door. The two ranch hands, Miguel and Tom, were informed of the potential threat and agreed to take turns keeping watch through the night. Vaughn didn't mention the true nature of Blackwell's interest in Zara, only that he was a dangerous man who might have a grudge against the ranch. After supper, Zara asked to speak with him privately. At the kitchen table, she wrote for several minutes, her pen moving rapidly across the pages of her journal. When she finished, she passed it to Vaughn. "I need to explain about James Blackwell," she had written. "He is the husband of the woman who took me in when Daniel left for California. At first they were both kind, but after a few weeks, I noticed Mr. Blackwell watching me. Mrs. Blackwell often went to visit her sister, and during one of these absences, he cornered me in the kitchen and made his intentions clear. When I refused his advances, he became angry. He said no one would believe a mute orphan over a respected businessman. He threatened that if I told anyone, he would claim I had tried to seduce him. The next time Mrs. Blackwell left, I packed my few belongings and fled. I worked in a restaurant kitchen for food and a place to sleep, then joined a wagon train of families heading west. I left them in Holbrook, hoping I had traveled far enough to be safe. I never imagined he would follow me. I'm sorry for not telling you the whole truth before. I was afraid you wouldn't want the complication." Vaughn read her words carefully, then looked up to find her watching him with apprehensive eyes. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "Nothing. You did what you had to do to stay safe." He wanted to say more to express the anger he felt toward Blackwell, the fierce protectiveness that surged through him at the thought of anyone threatening her. But words had never been his strong suit, so he simply reached across the table and took her hand again, hoping his touch could convey what his voice could not. Zara turned her hand to grasp his, her grip surprisingly strong, and in that moment, Vaughn knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever was necessary to keep her safe. The next day, Vaughn rode to the neighboring ranches, alerting them to watch for a stranger who might be asking about Zara. The Hayes ranch wasn't large or prosperous enough to have made many enemies, so any unusual interest in his household would stand out. His neighbors, appreciative of the warning, promised to send word if they spotted anyone suspicious. Life on the ranch continued, but with a new undercurrent of vigilance. Zara never went to the creek alone to do laundry now. Either Vaughn or one of the hands always kept watch. She carried a small derringer that Vaughn had given her, tucked into a pocket sewn especially for it in her apron. The weapon had belonged to his mother, and teaching Zara to use it had been a solemn occasion, her first lesson in what might become necessary self-defense. Despite the shadow of Blackwell's potential threat, or perhaps because of it, Vaughn and Zara grew closer. Their evening conversations, conducted through her writing and his spoken responses, became more personal. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, how he hoped to expand the herd and eventually build a larger house. She shared memories of her childhood in Philadelphia, of her father's patient tutoring and her mother's gentle guidance. One evening in early September, as they sat on the newly completed front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Zara wrote, "Do you ever feel lonely here, so far from other people?" Vaughn considered the question carefully. "Used to," he admitted. "Before you came. Now not so much." She smiled at that, a full smile that reached her eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. In the fading light, with her hair loosened from its usual practical bun, and her face softened by the glow of approaching twilight, she looked beautiful in a way that caught at something deep in Vaughn's chest. "Zara," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I'm not good with words, but I need to tell you something." She looked at him expectantly, her head tilted slightly to one side. "Having you here, it's changed things, changed me. I never thought I needed anyone else, but now." He trailed off, frustrated by his inability to express the tumult of feelings inside him. Zara reached for her journal, but instead of writing in it, she tore out a page and folded it carefully into the shape of a heart. She handed it to Vaughn, her eyes never leaving his face. The gesture, so simple and yet so eloquent, broke through the last of his reserves. "Yes," he said. "That's it exactly." He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she moved to meet him. When their lips touched, it was gentle at first, almost questioning, but then deepened into something more certain. Her hands came up to frame his face, her touch as eloquent as any words could have been. When they finally drew apart, Vaughn pressed his forehead to hers, overwhelmed by the intensity of what had just passed between them. "I never thought I'd find someone who understands me without me having to explain myself," he said quietly. "But you do, don't you?" Zara nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. She reached for her journal and wrote, "We speak the same language, you and I. It has nothing to do with words." October brought cooler temperatures and the cattle roundup. Vaughn and his two hands worked from dawn until dusk, gathering the herd, branding the calves born that spring, and preparing to drive the market-ready steers to the railroad at Winslow. It was exhausting work, but satisfying to see the fruits of a year's labor. Zara kept the men fed with hearty meals that appeared like clockwork: sourdough biscuits and strong coffee at dawn, sandwiches packed in cloth for midday, and substantial suppers of beef stew or pot roast when they returned bone-tired in the evenings. She seemed to anticipate their needs before they were spoken, having hot water ready for washing up, clean clothes laid out, and liniment for sore muscles. The evening before Vaughn was set to leave with the cattle drive, he found Zara in the kitchen, preparing food for the journey. She had been unusually subdued all day, her movements lacking their customary grace and efficiency. "It's only for a week," he said, leaning against the door frame. 10 days at most." She nodded without looking up, but her hand stilled on the biscuit dough she was kneading. "Miguel and Tom will both stay behind," Vaughn continued. "I've hired 2 other men to help with the drive. The ranch hands will take turns keeping watch, so you won't be alone." Zara finally turned to him, her expression troubled. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for her journal. "It's not about being alone," she wrote. "I've been alone most of my life. It's about you being gone. The trail can be dangerous, and with Blackwell still out there somewhere." She paused, then added, "I've lost everyone I've ever loved. I couldn't bear to lose you too." The words "I've ever loved" leaped from the page, striking Vaughn with the force of physical impact. They hadn't spoken of love directly, though it had been growing between them like a living thing, nurtured by shared work, quiet companionship, and deepening trust. "Zara," he said, crossing to her in 3 quick strides, "I'll come back. Nothing could keep me from coming back to you." He took her face between his hands, thumbs gently tracing the curve of her cheekbones. "When I return, there's something important I want to ask you. Something I should have asked already." Her eyes widened with understanding, and she nodded, a smile breaking through her worry like sunshine after rain. That night, they sat together on the porch long after darkness had fallen, Zara curled against Vaughn's side, his arm around her shoulders. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The stars wheeled overhead, the coyotes called in the distance, and the promise of a shared future hung in the air between them, as tangible as the scent of sage carried on the night breeze. The cattle drive departed at first light, 40 head of prime beef cattle heading for the railroad at Winslow. Vaughn rode at the front, occasionally glancing back at the ranch until it disappeared from view. It was the first time he'd left the property since Zara had arrived, and he felt the separation like a physical ache. For Zara, the days of Vaughn's absence stretched endlessly. She kept busy with her usual tasks, cooking for Miguel and Tom, tending the garden, preserving the last of the summer vegetables, and keeping the house in order. She also began preparations for winter, mending blankets, making candles, and stocking the root cellar with provisions. On the fourth day, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Expecting Miguel returning from checking the remaining cattle, she didn't look up until a shadow fell across the sheet she was pinning. James Blackwell sat on a dun-colored horse, looking down at her with cold, calculating eyes. He was a well-dressed man of about 40, with a neatly trimmed beard and the soft hands of someone unused to physical labor. But it was his smile that sent ice through Zara's veins, a smile that never reached his eyes. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of St. Louis society. "You've led me on quite a chase, my dear, but here you are at last, playing house with some cowboy." His gaze swept dismissively over the ranch. "Though I must say, you could have done better. This is hardly the life a woman of your talents deserves." Zara backed away, her hand moving to the pocket where her derringer was concealed. Tom and Miguel were out checking the herd, not expected back until evening. She was alone. Blackwell dismounted, tying his horse to the clothesline post. "Now, don't look so frightened. I've simply come to bring you home. My wife has been terribly worried about you running off as you did." His tone made it clear this was a lie. "Of course, I've had to explain your unfortunate condition to everyone I've asked along the way. Such a shame, a pretty young woman unable to speak, possibly confused in her mind as well." He took a step toward her, and Zara drew the derringer. Blackwell stopped, surprise registering briefly before his smile widened. "Come now, you wouldn't shoot me. Who would believe your side of the story? A mute orphan against a respected businessman. No, you'll put that toy away and come quietly. I have friends in this territory who will ensure no questions are asked." Zara's hand trembled, but she kept the gun pointed at his chest. She shook her head firmly. "Don't be foolish," Blackwell said, his voice hardening. "You have nowhere to run. Your cowboy is gone, your brother has abandoned you. I'm offering you protection, respectability. All you have to do is be agreeable." The implication in his tone made her stomach turn, but Zara stood her ground. She gestured with the gun toward his horse, indicating he should leave. "I see you need some persuasion," Blackwell said, his voice dangerously soft. "Perhaps this will convince you." He reached into his coat and withdrew a letter. "From your brother Daniel. He's been quite worried about you, especially after I told him you'd run away in a state of confusion. He's asked me to bring you to him in San Francisco." Zara's heart raced. Daniel was alive. In San Francisco, but something in Blackwell's too smooth tone rang false. She kept the gun steady, making no move to take the letter. Blackwell's facade of civility cracked. Enough games, he snapped, lunging forward to grab her wrist. The Derringer went off, the shot going wild as they struggled. Blackwell twisted her arm painfully, forcing her to drop the weapon. He kicked it away, then pulled her roughly against him. "You'll regret that," he hissed, his fingers digging into her arms hard enough to bruise. I was going to be kind, but now, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked interrupted him. "Let her go," Vaughn's voice came from behind them, as cold and hard as steel. "Now." Blackwell froze, then slowly turned his head to see Vaughn standing at the corner of the house, rifle aimed steadily at his chest. Relief flooded through Zara so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. "This is a private matter," Blackwell said, his voice regaining some of its smoothness. "Between me and my fiancée." "She's not your fiancée," Vaughn said, taking a step closer. "And nothing about Zara is your business. Let her go and get on your horse." Blackwell's grip tightened. "You're making a mistake. This woman is mentally unstable. Her brother entrusted her to my care." "Her brother did no such thing," Vaughn cut him off. "And the only mistake here is you thinking you could come to my ranch and threaten what's mine." The possessive claim might have bothered Zara under other circumstances, but in this moment, it felt like a shield. Vaughn declaring his protection in the clearest possible terms. "Last chance," Vaughn said, his finger visibly tightening on the trigger. "Let her go." Something in his tone must have convinced Blackwell that he was serious. He released Zara with a small shove that sent her stumbling forward. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I have friends in high places, not in Navajo County you don't," Vaughn said. "Now get on your horse and ride out, and be grateful I'm not putting a bullet in you for trespassing." Blackwell hesitated, looking from Vaughn's unwavering rifle to Zara, who had recovered her balance and was now standing tall, her chin lifted in defiance. Whatever he saw in their united front made him reconsider. He mounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster. "You haven't heard the last of this," he warned, wheeling his mount around. "Actually, I think we have," Vaughn replied. He didn't lower the rifle until Blackwell had ridden well beyond the property boundary. The moment the man was out of sight, Vaughn dropped the rifle and crossed to Zara in 3 long strides, gathering her into his arms. She clung to him, her body trembling with delayed shock and relief. "Are you hurt?" he asked, pulling back to examine her. His eyes darkened when he saw the marks Blackwell's fingers had left on her arms. "I should have shot him." Zara shook her head vehemently and pointed to Vaughn, a question in her eyes. "Why am I back early?" he interpreted. "Had a feeling. Couldn't explain it, just knew I needed to get home. Left the men to complete the drive without me." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch infinitely gentle. "Good thing I did." That evening, after Zara had calmed sufficiently to write, she told Vaughn everything Blackwell had said, including the claim about her brother being in San Francisco. "You think it could be true?" Vaughn asked. "About Daniel," Zara considered, then wrote, "Possibly. San Francisco would make sense if he was looking for shipping work, but I don't believe Daniel would ever send Blackwell to find me." "We could send a telegram to San Francisco," Vaughn suggested. "Try to locate him." Zara nodded, then wrote, "But what if Blackwell returns while we're waiting to hear? He seemed unbalanced." "He won't get near you again," Vaughn promised. "Tomorrow we're riding into town to talk to Sheriff Miller. Blackwell threatened you on my property. That's something the law can handle." True to his word, the next morning Vaughn took Zara to Holbrook to file a formal complaint against James Blackwell. Sheriff Miller listened gravely as Vaughn explained the situation, with Zara providing written details where necessary. "I'll send telegrams to the surrounding towns," the sheriff assured them. "He'll be wanted for trespassing and assault at minimum. If he shows his face in Navajo County again, he'll find himself in my jail." While they were in town, Vaughn also sent a telegram to the San Francisco Police Department, inquiring about Daniel Thornton. It would take days or even weeks to receive a response, but it was a start. As they prepared to return to the ranch, Vaughn made an unexpected stop at the small church on the outskirts of town. "Wait here," he told Zara, and disappeared inside. When he emerged 10 minutes later, he wore an expression she couldn't quite decipher, part determination, part nervousness. "Had a word with Reverend Wilson," he explained as they mounted up. "Just in case we need him. Soon." Zara raised an eyebrow, and Vaughn actually blushed, something she'd never seen before. "For a wedding," he clarified, "if you're amenable. I know it's sudden, but after yesterday. Life's too short and too uncertain to waste time." Her heart racing, Zara pulled out her small slate and wrote, "Are you proposing to me, Vaughn Hayes?" "Doing a poor job of it, apparently," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I had a whole speech planned for when I got back from the cattle drive. Was going to do it proper, down on one knee and all." Zara's smile was radiant. She wrote, "Yes. Whether you ask properly or not, my answer is yes." The ride back to the ranch seemed to take no time at all, their horses matching pace as naturally as their hearts had learned to beat in rhythm together. They were married 2 weeks later in the Holbrook church, with Miguel and Tom as witnesses, along with Mrs. Collins and a few other townspeople who had come to know and respect them. Zara wore a dress of deep blue that Mrs. Collins had helped her make, with tiny wildflowers woven into her hair. Vaughn, uncomfortable in his best shirt and string tie, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When it came time for the vows, Reverend Wilson had modified the traditional words to accommodate Zara's silence. Vaughn spoke his promises aloud, his voice steady and sure. Zara had written her vows in her journal, which Reverend Wilson read on her behalf while she looked directly into Vaughn's eyes, her expression conveying what words never could. At the reception held at the general store, Sheriff Miller approached them with news. "Got a response to your telegram," he told them. "Daniel Thornton is indeed in San Francisco, working for a shipping company. They've passed along your message, and he sent a reply." He handed Vaughn a telegram form, which Vaughn immediately gave to Zara. Her hands trembled as she read the words from her brother. Overjoyed to learn Zara safe stop, never sent Blackwell stop, warned authorities here about him stop, will visit when possible stop, send address stop, love Daniel. Tears filled Zara's eyes as she passed the telegram to Vaughn. Another piece of her past recovered. Another shadow lifted from their future together. As winter settled over the Arizona territory, the Hayes Ranch transformed under a light dusting of snow that made the desert seem magical and new. The house was now fully completed, with proper walls and a sturdy roof that kept out the worst of the weather. Inside, a fire burned cheerfully in the stone fireplace Vaughn had built, warming the main room where he and Zara spent their evenings. December brought news that James Blackwell had been arrested in Flagstaff for fraud and other charges unrelated to his harassment of Zara. It seemed his friends in high places had abandoned him when his financial dealings came to light. He would be spending several years in prison far from Holbrook and the Hayes Ranch. January brought another piece of news, this one discovered by Zara herself and communicated to Vaughn through a note left beside his breakfast plate one morning. "We will need to prepare a nursery by summer. Our family is growing." Vaughn read the note twice, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension to joy so pure it transformed his usually stoic features. He looked across the table at Zara, who was watching him with nervous anticipation. "A baby?" he asked, his voice scarcely above a whisper. She nodded, her hands resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Vaughn was around the table in an instant, pulling Zara to her feet and into his arms. He lifted her and spun her around, laughing in a way she'd never heard before, uninhibited and full of wonder. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have a family," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Never thought I deserved one. But you've changed everything, Zara. You and our child, you're everything I never knew to wish for." That spring, as new life stirred in the desert and in Zara's growing form, Daniel Thornton finally made his journey to Holbrook. Vaughn met him at the stagecoach and brought him to the ranch, where Zara waited anxiously on the porch. The reunion between brother and sister was tearful and joyous, full of embraces and hastily written notes as Zara attempted to share all that had happened since their separation. Daniel stayed for 2 weeks, getting to know his brother-in-law and helping with preparations for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from pine wood harvested from the hills to the north, carving the family name Hayes into the headboard. When he departed, it was with a promise to return when his niece or nephew was born, and with the knowledge that his sister was truly happy and safe at last. Summer arrived with relentless heat that made Zara's final months of pregnancy especially challenging. Vaughn fussed over her constantly, bringing her cool water from the creek, fashioning a swinging chair for the porch where she could catch the evening breeze, and taking over many of her household duties despite her written protests. "You've been taking care of me since the day you arrived," he told her firmly. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." In August, just as the first hints of autumn began to soften the summer's harsh edges, their son was born with the assistance of a midwife from town. He arrived with a lusty cry that made both parents laugh through their tears of joy. They named him William Daniel Hayes, William after Vaughn's father and Daniel after Zara's brother. As Vaughn held his son for the first time, looking down at the tiny face that somehow combined features from both himself and Zara, he felt a sense of completion he'd never known was possible. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, cradling the baby in one arm while taking Zara's hand with his free one. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for coming here, for staying, for teaching me that silence isn't the same as being alone." Zara smiled tiredly and squeezed his hand. She didn't need words to tell him that he had given her just as much a home, safety, love, and now a family to replace the one she had lost. In the years that followed, the Hayes ranch prospered. The herd grew, the house expanded to accommodate more children, a daughter, Elizabeth, born 2 years after William, and another son, James, 2 years after that. Vaughn hired more hands and built additional buildings, including a schoolhouse where Zara taught not only their children but also the children of their employees. Though Zara never gained the ability to speak, she was far from silent. Her journal became volumes, filled with observations, recipes, household accounts, and family stories. She wrote letters regularly to Daniel, who eventually married and settled in San Francisco. She corresponded with other ranchers' wives, exchanging advice and friendship through the written word. And she taught her children both languages, the spoken one their father used, and the unspoken one that had first connected their parents. The Hayes children grew up fluent in the language of gestures, expressions, and touch that Vaughn and Zara had developed, as well as proper sign language that Daniel sent them books about from the city. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Vaughn surprised Zara with a special gift, a proper piano for the main room of their now substantial house. Music, he had discovered early in their marriage, was another language Zara spoke fluently. Her fingers on the keys could express joy, sorrow, love, and every emotion between with a clarity that needed no translation. That evening, as autumn painted the desert in gold and crimson just as it had on the day they first acknowledged their feelings for each other, Zara played while their children and grandchildren gathered around. Vaughn stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, feeling the music flow through her and into him. When she finished the piece, she looked up at him with the same expressive eyes that had first caught his attention all those years ago in the Holbrook General Store. They had aged, both of them, with lines etched by sun and laughter and occasional sorrow. But what passed between them in that look needed no words, no translation. It was the language of a love that had begun in silence and grown to fill a home, a family, and two lives that had once been solitary but now were irrevocably, joyfully intertwined.